My name is Kelly Batley.
My name is Clay Thompson.
My name is Neil Mowney.
We are MRHFM, a national firm with 70 attorneys and 11 offices across the U.S.
At MRHFM, we exclusively help mesothelioma patients and their families. It's all we do.
This is why we are proud to sponsor the Mesothelioma Applied Research Foundation and its work to fund mesothelioma research and provide support services and education for patients and their families.
At Bristol Myers Squibb, we believe that a single touch has the power to transform, to help make every day better, fuller, happier, healthier. So we are always working, proving that innovation and compassion work best hand in hand, developing clinical trials that better reflect the communities we serve, ensuring that every breakthrough reaches those who count on them the most, striving to change the world, starting with a single life. Yours.
At Novacure, we strive to extend survival in some of the most aggressive forms of cancer through the development and commercialization of our innovative therapy called Tumor Treating Fields. Novacure is pleased to partner again with the Meso Foundation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for jumping on to this MesoTV episode. Today, we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Andrea Wolf from Mount Sinai with us. She has started the New York Mesothelioma Program at Mount Sinai, and she's currently the director of that program as well. Dr. Wolf, if you would just introduce yourself and let us know what you do and where you're at.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much, Shannon. My name is Andrea Wolf. I'm a thoracic surgeon who's been in practice for 10 years here in New York. I'm the director of the New York Mesothelioma Program at Mount Sinai. We see patients as a multidisciplinary team. I'm the surgeon. I have medical oncologists, radiation oncologists, social workers, oncogeneralists, as well as the possibility of referral to psychiatry and other support. Patients are also offered opportunities to enroll in clinical trials. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you, Shannon, for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I'm going to get a little background on your surgical approach and such, and then we'll kind of jump into what clinical trials you do have available right now. So I guess I wanted to know, first of all, what is your surgical approach to pleural mesothelioma?
Okay, great question. So the first step in determining if somebody is a surgical candidate and the surgical approach is just making sure and confirming it is mesothelioma. Sometimes other pleural tumors or other cancers can go to the pleural space. So the pleura is the lining of the lung and the chest wall. And the treatments are so vastly different that the surgical approach to mesothelioma is really only relevant to mesothelioma, except in certain circumstances. So once we've confirmed the diagnosis, most patients sent to a surgeon are at least generally candidates for surgery. It's a matter of approaching it carefully, making sure a surgery would benefit them, and making sure they can tolerate surgery. And so what I mean by benefit for mesothelioma, characteristics that confer better survival are the ones that we think would do best with surgery in the context of other therapies or multimodal therapy. In terms of who would be a surgical candidate, it's a person who has disease confined to the space that we can operate on, which is the same chest. In other words, if somebody has disease in the rare circumstance where it goes to other organs, it is unlikely that that person would benefit. Never say never or always, but it's less likely that they would benefit from surgery, certainly not in the first kind of grand scheme. We do have some patients who have treated over the years who have had mesothelioma on both sides. It's extremely unusual. So in some circumstances, we might treat both sides, but generally speaking, it's for disease confined to one side in the chest. So there are imaging and an evaluation that we do in order to make sure of that. And then the ability to tolerate surgery. So that's from a heart and lung standpoint, and sort of all the organs working together. There's no one thing that would make somebody not a surgical candidate. It's just a matter of making sure you can get them through surgery, that you tailor the surgery to them. And sometimes it involves sort of optimizing people. I've had patients who've needed cardiac procedures or other procedures in a timely fashion to help them survive the treatment we need to do. So it's a matter of thinking through these things, planning, and moving quickly. We obviously don't want to delay patients' cancer care. In terms of the surgical approach itself, generally speaking, a pleurectomy decortication has been found to be the best option. And so what that is that's the removal of the lining of the chest wall, the mediastinum, or the compartment in the middle of the chest. So it's generally the removal of the lining of the pericardium. Sometimes it involves removing the pericardium itself. That's the sac that surrounds the heart, and the lining that is overlying the diaphragm, the muscle that separates the chest and the belly. Sometimes that involves removing the diaphragm itself and then putting things back together. In rare circumstances, we do have to remove the lung. It is less common than we used to think. It tends to be situations in which the tumor really invades the lung and the lung's sort of dead, so to speak, anyway. And in all of these circumstances, the key again is making sure you do the right surgery for the right patient. It needs to benefit them, and it needs to not to hurt them or maim them, as I sometimes say.
Thank you. I'm gonna kind of go back to one thing that you said, because I do get this question actually quite often from either patients or people who think that they could have mesothelioma because of symptoms or past history of exposure. But what truly gives a diagnosis of mesothelioma? So I get a lot of people who think that there's a blood test available that you can do to diagnose it. So from your perspective and from the mesothelioma medical perspective, what gives you that diagnosis?
Such a great question. The holy grail of early diagnosis and screening and detection is some sort of blood test, and we're getting closer every year, but we're not there. So to just be very specific, there is currently no blood test that can diagnose mesothelioma. We often say in medicine, tissue is the issue. And so the tissue and the pleural space, and I do mean tissue, generally speaking, the fluid itself is not always accurate. I'll come back to that. But tissue, the actual pleura with the tumor, has to be biopsied. And sometimes that requires more, a needle. Sometimes that requires pieces surgically. And it has to be reviewed by pathologists who know what they're looking at. It's certain features under the microscope. It's certain we call them receptors and stains that are used, certain processing that recognizes certain features that are very specific to mesothelioma and rule out other cancers. So there are things about how the little cells look under the microscope that can masquerade as other types of cancers, specifically as lung cancer that has spread to the pleural, to the chest lining. And those are treated very differently. A lot of patients who have mesothelioma will show up with fluid that we call pleural effusion. That's fluid in between the lung and the rib cage. And people will sometimes refer to this as fluid on the lungs or water on the lungs. It's very specific. It's between the lung and the rib cage. There should be nothing in between there. And these people and these patients, sometimes fluid piles up in there. And that's often the first sign. Their symptom might be shortness of breath, sometimes even pain, but that's the sign that a physician will find that is concerning for mesothelioma, among other conditions. It doesn't mean they have mesothelioma. And when that fluid is sampled, it may show mesothelioma about 40% of the time. So meaning if somebody has mesothelioma and they have that fluid and that fluid is sampled, still only about 40% of the time it'll show it. So it's that you see why it's not as helpful, or we call that sensitive, meaning when somebody has a disease and the test recognizes that disease, we call that the sensitivity of that test of detecting that disease. And for pleural fluid and mesothelioma, it's only about 40%. So a lot of patients will come to us having had repeated procedures of draining fluid. Well, this fluid was there, they drained out 2 liters. That's like a half gallon. And it comes back. And they do it again. And every time the fluid is either reactive or abnormal or benign, meaning not cancerous, and it's just the index of suspicion or the concern and making sure that we're not missing something has to be a little higher in people who've had asbestos exposure or other concerning things. So the tissue is sort of the sort of gold standard of making that diagnosis. Occasionally we can see that pleural fluid gets sampled and show mesothelioma, and it turns out people have something else. And so that's a little bit of a flip side of a similar coin. But that's why we generally need to get tissue to confirm that diagnosis.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful because, like I said, I do often get that people think it's as simple as a blood test or as simple as a tumor marker, but we're just not there yet. We know that there are some that we can see some elevation in, but certainly not a diagnosis for us. So thank you for explaining that. I appreciate that. I wanted to touch base on one other thing that you had said. So a person with pleural mesothelioma, can they become a surgical candidate if there is minimal disease outside of the pleural space?
Excellent and slightly controversial question. You know, in the modern era, when we have a lot of sophisticated therapies, we're seeing it more and more. And in some rare circumstances, yes, I would never say absolutely not. We used to say there's never a role for it, but what we're finding, especially with some of these modern therapies, and we'll come to talk about the trial in particular that I'm excited about, is one of the signals we're seeing is that things that we do to the tumor in the pleural space may have what we call abscopal, meaning it affects other sites of disease that are elsewhere, effects. And so if we can get things that affect that so that other disease disappears, there may be a role for surgery in that person. It's extremely unusual. So I don't like to say it that this is the standard of care, but I've certainly had patients in the last 10 to 15 years who've had lymph nodes in the other chest, who've done quite well. You know, they get therapy. Everything else sort of disappears. There's some residual disease that I can manage with surgery inside the chest. The key is for somebody to be a surgical candidate or for there to be a role for surgery in that person, the disease elsewhere has to be controlled, because what we do with surgery, or even I often say with radiation, is sort of local, meaning surgery and radiation itself, generally speaking, only affect the parts that you operate on or radiate. And so that has to be taken into account. And so if somebody has active disease elsewhere and you focus your attention just on the disease in the chest, particularly with surgery, you're going to set them back. You're going to weaken their immune system. And while that's happening, the disease elsewhere could spiral or could escalate. And so in order to do what's right for them in the big picture, you have to have something controlling that. And we'll come to talk about it, but some of these therapies are very exciting for their ability to sort of tee up controlling other disease or even preparing people for the development of other disease if it were to happen.
Yeah, thank you so much. I get that question a lot too. People often ask me, well, what if they have distant disease? Well, why can't they just take out what's in the lung, or where it started, and which is a very valid question. But obviously, to do that is a large surgery, and at that point you're not watching what's happening everywhere else, and we need to get that under control. So thank you for explaining that. And sometimes you're doing not as much good if you're not systemically fighting everything. So yeah, thank you, that was great. So I wanted to ask, because I know that you have a couple of exciting clinical trials going on there. So what trials are you currently running at Mount Sinai for mesothelioma?
Thank you again also for bringing that up. So we actually have a few trials, one of which is focused specifically for mesothelioma patients. So I'll really focus on that. I will mention that we have other trials for patients in mesothelioma, as well as other cancer spaces that we're putting that patients are eligible for. For patients who are eligible for surgery, we currently have two trials, with our focus being on the one that I'm running right now, and that's involving this poly-ICLC. It's a vaccine. It's a synthetic vaccine, meaning that it doesn't come from any virus or any other infectious agents. It's actually an FDA-approved drug that's used in the treatment of other cancers, but this is the first time it's being used in mesothelioma. So this is a phase 1B trial, which just means that we have a dose that's been proven safe in other cancer settings that we are now using for mesothelioma patients, and we're evaluating whether it's safe and what side effects it has in patients with mesothelioma. We inject this drug, like little 2 cc's of it, meaning a very small injection, into the tumor itself. We do this under numbing medicine in a CAT scanner. And actually, at the time that we do that, we take additional biopsies that are going to be used for research. So in other words, we use some numbing medication in the CAT scanner to see where the kind of thicker sites of disease are. We stick this needle in, we take some samples out through that needle, and through the same needle, we inject this poly-ICLC. And this is done 2 to 4 weeks before surgery. Now, this drug has the impact of kind of revving up the immune system with both in a sort of general way. In other words, there are some pathways in the immune system that can do things no matter what, and then there are some that sort of develop recognition of that person's specific tumor, like not just mesothelioma, not just the particular type of mesothelioma, but actually that person's particular mesothelioma.
Wow.
And it sort of draws the immune system's attention while there's still disease in them to recognize it. Because this is a newer therapy and we don't know whether it's effective in actually treating the disease, we don't want to delay what we call the sort of standard care therapies. And so in our practice, in my group, in our program, for patients who can tolerate surgery or are candidates for surgery, we go straight to surgery. So within 2 to 4 weeks, we go to surgery, we remove the disease. We then, from a sort of scientific standpoint, look at the specimens, meaning the tissue before and after, but that's sort of a side branch of it. What we're anticipating clinically and what we're starting to see is that then they go on to have whatever treatment they would have, whether it's radiation or chemotherapy or both. It sort of depends on the individual patient and the individual situation. And we have a multidisciplinary team, so these decisions are made together. But what we've seen, first of all, it's been, we're about 9 or 10 patients in, everybody's tolerated. That, some people get a little low-grade fever, sort of feel a little flu-like for a day, or not even. So it's well tolerated. By itself, we're not seeing much. But when we give those additional therapies, we're seeing that there have been patients who've had disease that we didn't realize was outside of the chest. In other words, as you're following patients, they may develop other sites of disease, and we're seeing those just disappear. And so our theory, and we're still putting together the data. This is, to do this in a scientifically rigorous way, we need to do, we're actually currently writing another protocol to evaluate that specific question in terms of the effectiveness. But our hypothesis and what we're sort of seeing both in the lab and a little bit, anecdotally in patients, is that it seems to rev up the immune system to help support other therapies, so that even not just where we're operating or where we're radiating, but in these other locations, we're seeing responses to chemotherapy and other drugs that we've never seen before. This abscopal effect that I described earlier. So it's pretty exciting, and not something I've ever seen before in mesothelioma, having been looking at this really closely for years.
Very exciting. Now, to get the poly-ICLC vaccine, does your tumor have to express something certain, or that's not even?
That's the beauty of it. And that's such a great question, Shannon, because a lot of these targeted therapies and immunotherapies are, in other cancers, especially based on certain expression of, you and I know the jargon, but for all of our patients, basically certain signals that the tumor has. And in mesothelioma, they have high signals for this, where these therapies should be super effective in mesothelioma, but they're not. We're seeing, great results in melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer, certain, something called PD-L1. A lot of people may see commercials for some of these drugs. I don't know how if I can say trade names or not, but you see them out there. But in mesothelioma, we're finding they're effective in some patients, but not the ones we would expect based on the expression, based on the things that we see in other cancers. What we see happening here is some tumors are just cold, like they don't respond the way you'd expect. This poly-ACLC seems to turn those into hot, meaning that they're able to respond in that way. And right now, we don't see a particular pattern or sort of blueprint for who is responding and who's not, but we are seeing that these tumors that were otherwise not responding are. Wow. And so by itself, I don't know, I wouldn't say much about it by itself, but with other therapies, it seems to take it to a much more effective level for that reason. But right now, we're not seeing specific biomarkers that suggest one person benefits and another doesn't.
Wonderful. As far as the trial that is open right now, how many patients are you looking to accrue in that trial?
So our sample size is 18. So it'll close at 18. But as we're sort of on the back half of that, because it's been open for almost 2 years now, we're opening up another trial, so that we look to have another one open, actually probably two, both for patients who are surgical candidates who will get sort of neoadjuvant therapy, meaning therapy before they get surgery, as well as for people who aren't. We're opening up a trial for patients who are not surgical candidates too, sort of complete the picture of the profile of what we have available, because we're pretty excited about what we're seeing, and we want to make sure that patients can benefit from it.
Wow, that's wonderful. So as of right now, the trial that is open, they do need to be surgical candidates. They get the vaccine, which is injected actually into the tumor, and then they go to surgery somewhere around 4 weeks later.
Yeah, 2 to 4 weeks.
2 to 4 weeks, okay. And then they can go on with some sort of adjuvant treatment if necessary. But you are hopeful in opening up 2 more trials, and one will be for non-surgical patients.
Exactly.
Wonderful. And with those non-surgical patients, they will be pairing this vaccine with something else.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. With sort of the treatments that have been shown to have a role in mesothelioma. We often say there's no exact standard of care. We've seen some exciting things with both cisplatin pemetrexed-based chemotherapy, IPI, Nivo immunotherapy, particularly certain type of cancer. So it would be paired with those. That's the trial, is to pair it with what we're calling standard treatment for unresectable mesothelioma, meaning mesothelioma that can't be removed, at least up front.
Now, do we know how this poly-ICLC, do we know what is it made up of? why are we using it, I guess, in the space of cancers?
It's a protein. It's just immunoactive. It's been shown to sort of generate certain immune cells to bring them in. Just not to use too much jargon, but dendritic cells, NK cells, sort of T cells. It just sort of draws things in. It was originally in one form that was sort of improved for stability in terms of injection, and it was used initially in the space of glioblastoma. That's a brain tumor that some people may have heard of, that's known to be devastating, and it's had some success there, which sort of clued people in that it might have some role for some aggressive or difficult to treat cancers.
Yeah, great. And when are you hoping, I know you probably can't say for sure, but maybe in the next year or so for the other two trials to open?
Yes, exactly.
Great.
Yeah, there's a little bit of there are processes done to protect everyone, particularly patients, that sort of have to be met in terms of the IRB and our scientific review and that sort of, and funding.
Yes. And is there somebody in particular that patients should get in touch with if they're interested to know if they're a candidate, to get in to see you as a referral, or somebody on the team?
Yeah, I'm sort of the point person. I have a whole team, so people, maybe at the end of this, we can share both my email address and the phone number for my Meso program, which is my office phone number. I'm sort of the point person, and I'm happy for people to reach out. I think it's important, that especially patients and caregivers, to have access to everything. People should never feel compelled or obligated, but they need to be informed, and they get to be armed, and they get to ask questions. And I feel very strongly about that.
Yes, definitely. And I am assuming that on your mesothelioma team, there is some sort of a social worker involved as well, to help those people maybe from out of state that would want to come and see you. Getting that sort of help as to where to stay and those types of things.
Exactly. There are some resources available. We have a great social worker involved in the program, and we do see a lot of patients from out of state and even out of the country, and so it's something we're sort of able to at least help navigate, because we have a nurse navigator as well as a social worker who can help coordinate that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and we as a foundation also do have a travel grant for patients who want to travel to see one of the experts in mesothelioma, as well as if they were to go on to the clinical trial, we do support some with that to try and help offset some of those travel costs. So yeah, something
That's
that your
amazing.
team. Yeah, absolutely.
It's something that has been important to me since my beginning. I operated on my first meso patient as a resident 18 years ago, and it's something that I've had a very specific interest in for over 15 years now, and it's something over the years that I've seen. The idea that somebody may not get the care they need based on resources, finances, access, is horrifying to me. And so I've always been inspired by, impressed with, and helped contribute and try to form programs that can do that. So you guys are amazing. Martha's amazing for doing that, because it's critical. It helps reduce the disparities. I published a paper that showed outcomes were different for Black patients with mesothelioma than white patients with mesothelioma, and it's unacceptable. And it was tied very closely to the ability to have surgery, and so at least having the options and can help reduce these disparities, and give people choices.
Absolutely. And I asked this question of many of the doctors when I interview them, especially when it pertains to a clinical trial. But for you, for a patient that would say to you, "Why would I be on a clinical trial?" What would your answer to that be?
It's a very personal decision. The most important thing is that the person feels that they have options, but not obligated to do that clinical trial. It is very important that the clinical, depending on the phase of the clinical trial, it has to be thought that it would benefit them more than it would harm them. It has to be a question that's being investigated. It has to be generally thought to have an equal likelihood, we call it equipoise, and we would never want to test some drug that has an unknown effect, but takes away other options from that person. So particularly if something is known to be helpful and the likelihood is that it'll benefit that patient, then a clinical trial offers that patient a potentially better outcome. But you have to weigh that against whatever risks are involved and whatever side effect or impact of that clinical trial is. If it involves a significant hardship to them for whatever reason, it has to be considered. It's a very personal decision. So clinical trials should offer the patient options. It should not be they're getting a certain treatment because that's the one that provider is interested in looking at. That's the wrong reason to be involved in a clinical trial. And the provider they need to be seeing a provider who's willing to do treatment either way, to make sure that the priority is the patient and how the patient's going to do. If the clinical trial offers them an additional option that is thought to benefit or is thought likely to benefit them more than harm them, or at the least won't harm them at all in a significant way and might benefit them, that it's sort of a very important individualized risk benefit calculation. It's an excellent question.
Yeah. And one other question that I get quite often is in this trial, and I get this about most all trials, there is no placebo, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the trials involving placebos are phase 3 trials where we're really looking at the impact in terms of whether it's recurrence, progression, recurrence-free survival, or some survival endpoint, meaning whether people do better on that drug or not. Those are that's like the highest level and the best test for some of these things. A randomized controlled trial. And the purpose of the placebo in an ideal world, it's blind and nobody knows who's gotten placebo and who hasn't. So it even reduces other what we call confounders or sort of confusing things that can affect interpretation of results. But a lot of this is moving so fast that we do things like window of opportunity trials and trials in order to look. We're looking at the primary endpoint of this trial has nothing to do, I hate to say it, the primary endpoint is not how this drug does. The primary endpoint is just making sure it's safe to give in mesothelioma. Next step is making sure it's safe to give with our other standard therapies. And then the step after that is really to see what the results are. And for phase 2 trials, which is in between this trial and this ideal phase 3 placebo-controlled trial, the phase 2 trials sort of look at how therapy does, and you compare it to what we call historic standards. And if you start to see something that really looks good, in an ideal world, you would do a randomized control trial with placebo. A lot of I'm an epidemiologist is my other hat. I have a master in public health. And so a lot of us think this way. In an ideal world, we'd be doing all sorts of randomized control trials. Some of it's not practical and some of it would take, you'd have a hard time sort of recruiting to and getting long enough in order to do safely. So there's a famous example on this trial. It's the concept of nobody's ever done a randomized control trial to test whether parachutes or no parachutes. The placebo where the parachute doesn't open. I mean, you think it's gonna, but surprise! And nobody tests whether that in a randomized control way. And so that's a very famous joke in epidemiology and even biostats about you can't always get that placebo-controlled data, but there are other, if there's enough data to support doing something that will still that can still change practice. And in the future, we may do some placebo-controlled trials with this, but we're still in the early phases. Excellent question.
Thank you for explaining that. I try to explain to people that, especially in the oncology world, generally, if there is a placebo involved, it's involved with with standard of care or some sort of treatment. most trials do not give placebo versus a drug, because obviously we're wanting to control the cancer or see if we can further treatment with the cancer. So thank you for explaining that. I appreciate that. Well, I want to thank you for coming today. We've loved having you. This has been a great session. It's been very eye-opening. I think this trial is, wow, it's very amazing, and hopefully we're going to see even bigger and better things come from this.
Thank you. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for what you do for our patients. Thanks to the organization for what you guys do for our patients and helping raise awareness, support the patients, and support further research and getting this. We got to improve the survival for this disease in a good way. So please reach out if you have any additional questions, and thanks for your time, Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks so much.